I come with two slave of the Jenny Farrell show, 40 ruble garage, and show the jacket with me. Agus like Féile in the show. Welcome to everybody. Those who travelled from faraway places like Éireannach and Galway City and places like that, but some have come much further, and you're very welcome. And we appreciate people travelling out of interest for the Féile. Emiliana ta show hen dehu Féile, so sto I gur kinol Féile is Marxach de Cuireann is goed met Emiliana ja hoe Féile is din show in Ismór agus bin se jazz ké noch blin hartar agus fan met dinati chéna goni ó na dain seo wintertí agus winter na lein agus tá Dorná beg loyalist an sin an tosa winter na lein vinslin chu blin tá si an spinchit party na goni. So this is a milestone. I suppose we have 10 years of Féile Uí Fhlaithearta, of 10 years of festivals, and looking back, I suppose we are looking back. We have done a lot of work in that time in terms of publications. We'll be talking about the republication of Liam's books, particularly by úrscéalta. There's a book of Tom O'Flaherty's short stories, and I suppose looking forward then, one of the next items on the agenda hopefully will be a selection of the best of Tom O'Flaherty's journalism, which will be practically all in English, of course. We're looking backwards also and thinking of people who have died in the past year. Particularly on this year's programme, we'll be paying homage to Peggy O'Flaherty, who died recently, the daughter of Liam, and also Thomas Maximon, whose company republished the O'Flaherty books, which is a very important development, I think. And we also think of other people who are here and relatives of people who are present who died in the past year, and we think of those looking backwards. Tá muid breanú siar freisin ó híomh ábhar na Féile rístim léana. Cuasaí staire bhealach bheits arsúlach cuasaí litríocht a chomá agus cuasaí sóisialach is sean ó chluise sib tróna. An saor stát agus na Fhlaithearta sin téma na bliana seo, the Free State and the O'Flahertys, agus bhí méid seo le méid písin beg bídeach le Tom, méid bhí le raig Tom san úrscéal scríb sé faoi muinteoireáin agus an Free State. Déarach muinteoireáin leat an nar chur an trúid bhí néir an níideag séideag ahrúbe mealach ar hír na daine methe, ach go bei trid chun na talún an revolution of ris crit na díirní talún agus thug beg an síirse go na Féile bega. So sin blase beg go méide an legan mar dearach chur Thomas amach faoi hecht an Sear State agus Free State agus cloise sib rintha eile gon cinál céanna in sna PC Westmod léamh machtróna balbeg sa margin Cuireann. So for this year's programme we have, as usual, a mix of lectures, readings, a film, we'll have poetry reading and music and song this evening as well. Bhailm freisin buíochas a ghlacad nar nóirithe, the sponsors who are always generously helping the society and the Féile, Forras na Gaeilge, Údarás na Gaeltachta, through its Ally na Gaeltachta scheme, the Arts Council, and also Comhairle Contae na Gaillimhe, the Galway County Council, who are again, all our sponsors are loyal, like our members, and I'd like to pay tribute as well to the Coiste, who've been working away all year, the Coiste of the society, who are all very committed people, I have to say. Having taken over as chairperson, well, I knew the work that people are doing, but I think we have ní breagra Coiste an éifeachta ar fad. Bhailm freisin buíochas a ghabhar le Kilmurphy House as fáilte go rón in seo rístim léana. agus an takeíocht freisin Huggins teachósta tí Joe Mac dún Joe Mac's pub where we'll be tomorrow morning. So sin díreach couple of focal nis le túsachar le himachtaí. Cantor Relanio, today's speaker, Jenny Farrell, is going to talk about the Uí Fhlaithearta's novels and the Free State. Jenny has a distinguished record of publishing. She wrote her PhD on Keats' poetry and subsequently published a book which is, I suppose, an angle on Keats' poetry, looking at it from a revolutionary potential standpoint. She's also published an analysis of the tragedies of Shakespeare, and in recent years, wherever she gets the time between her job and the Costa and various other things she does, she's also brought out 3 anthologies of Irish writers' working class literature. The Plough to the Stars, which is a prose anthology of Irish working class literature. Children of the Nation, you recognise the echo there, Children of the Nation, a selection of poetry, an anthology of poetry, and Land of the Ever Young, Tír an Óg, I suppose, for young people. She writes regularly in Culture Matters, and is a prolific critic, I think it's fair to say, as well as being, in between all these things, a stalwart of the committee for many years now. So, bhailim fáilte with Jenny, agus íriorthaí príomhléacht mar sin, príomhléacht na Féile, about you. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so this lecture is about Uí Fhlaithearta. Not all of his novels, but specifically the novels that deal with the unfolding Free State of Ireland, just in the 20s largely, but I will explain as I go through. So, Uí Fhlaithearta's literary output in the 1920s is nothing short of astonishing. From the publication of his first novel, Thy Neighbour's Wife, in 1923, he published 1 novel per year. The Black Soul, 1924, The Informer, 1925, Mr. Gilhooly, 1926, The Assassin, 1928, and in 1929 he published 2 novels, Return of the Brute and The House of Gold. In addition, he published over 80 short stories, including collections during these 7 years between 23 and 29. 80 short stories on top of a novel every year. The overwhelming number of his short story output was written in the 20s. O'Flaherty's unequalled literary output continued into the 1930s and then subsides after around 1937. So O'Flaherty's greatest literary productivity coincides with the years of the Irish Free State. Following his first 2 novels, Thy Neighbour's Wife, set in 1910, on an island of the west coast of Ireland, and Black Soul, again set on a west coast island which explores the psychological devastation of a returned soldier from World War I. O'Flaherty, after this, O'Flaherty turns his attention to the unfolding Irish Free State, and in this begins his comprehensive criticism of post-colonial society. He continued writing at a breathtaking speed in the 1930s, still producing a new book almost every year until 1937. Apart from the Puritan, 1932, and the Martyr, 1933, most other work of the 1930s is not directly concerned with the contemporary Irish Free State. They are the historical novel Skerrit, 32, Famine, 37, as well as the political and social satire set away from Ireland. I Went to Russia, 1931, Hollywood Cemetery, 1935, and later novels then published in 46, Land, and Insurrection in 1950. Like Famine before them, these look at key events in Irish history, and he is quite unique among Irish writers in writing that type of historical novel, where he looks at these key events. He was the first to write about, the first artist to deal with the famine. He does that in his book Famine in 1937. So, as we are here concerned, though, with Liam O'Flaherty's perception in his novels of the Irish Free State, I will look specifically at the novels that deal with the contemporary Irish society of the 1920s and early 1930s. They are the 5 novels: The Informer, Mr. Gilhooly, The Assassin, The House of Gold, and The Puritan, published in the space of just 7 years between 1925 and 1932. I am not including any novels written contemporaneously that are not direct comments on the present day of writing of the 1920s. So, O'Flaherty had left Ireland on the 9th of July 1922 after the defeat of the anti-treaty forces in the Battle of Dublin, with whom he had been involved, and moved to London, where he started to write, having had some journalistic experience as editor of the Irish Communist Party's weekly paper, Workers' Republic. In 1923, so, at the age of just 26, O'Flaherty published his first short story, The Sniper, which we will be hearing as Gaeilge this afternoon, and his first novel, Thy Neighbour's Wife. One of his close associates in London was Karl Lahr, a German socialist who ran the Progressive Bookshop in Red Lion Street, and whose circle included many progressive writers. Lahr also published some of O'Flaherty's work, notably short stories, and his only play, Darkness. We put that on some years ago. Here in Ireland. In this circle around Lahr, O'Flaherty was steeped in the expressionist wave that was sweeping through the arts of Europe. And we'll hear a little bit more about this expressionism as I go through the lecture. I just want to note it here, this is happening in Europe, and O'Flaherty is exposed to it through Karl Lahr's bookshop in England, and he takes that on board for most of the 20s. So, in this context and in the overall context of O'Flaherty's oeuvre, it is worth noting that Thy Neighbour's Wife is written in the tradition of realism. Indeed, one could argue socialist realism. It's not for today, but there is a very interesting lecture, if you like, on his socialist realism. But we're not doing that today. Today, it'll be largely expressionism. But I will comment and explain further as we go along. So, why can I say that Thy Neighbour's Wife is written in the tradition of realism, indeed socialist realism? It clearly refers to the class makeup of the island population. It contains a character of socialist, indeed atheist convictions, John Carmody, recently returned from the US, referencing Tom O'Flaherty. And people who have a sense of pride in a past of land league agitation. There's a differentiated portrayal of clerics from O'Flaherty's point of view as essentially anti-people and in league with the ruling class, but also capable of growing religious doubts in the curate Father McMahon. It includes in its cast characters with a Connaught Rangers background, Hugh O'Malley, and of chieftain stock, now of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and later Sinn Féin. It further includes references to the Gaelic revival and portrays an essentially pagan people. In its social sweep, it foreshadows O'Flaherty's later historical novels of the 1930s, where he returns to a more realist style and they are less expressionistically heightened in their portrayal of the subject matter, as had been typical of the novels of between 25 and 29. However, despite its interest for many other reasons, Thy Neighbour's Wife does not concern us here today, as we are focusing on the novels that depict the early years of the Irish Free State and O'Flaherty's contemporary literary reflection on it. For that reason, we're also leaving out The Black Soul, with its exploration of shell shock, an anti-war theme that O'Flaherty fully develops in The Return of the Brute, published in 1929. So, O'Flaherty's grappling with the new Irish Free State begins properly with The Informer, possibly his most famous work. It is set in the immediate present of just after the Civil War. Liam O'Flaherty did not comment extensively on his work in his letters. There's one exception, however, in which he gives a rare insight into the conception of the work that became his literary breakthrough and his most famous novel, The Informer, and in a letter dated the 18th of September 1924 to his publisher Garnet, he writes, I quote, I have envisaged a brutal, immensely strong, stupid character, a man built by nature, made to be a tool for evil-minded intelligence. With gathering speed, the Informer is enmeshed by his enemies. His vast strength crumbles up overwhelmed by gathering waves of incomparable intelligence. He stands alone without the guidance of a mind to succor him, seeking an outlet for his useless strength, finding that it is no longer strength but a helpless thing, a target for the beings that press around to harass it. Then the informer makes a last effort to escape. Here the style completely changes and becomes a wild storm, cascading, abandoned, poetic. If this sounded a bit kind of convoluted to you, or with a lot of kind of emotion and less distance, he is in fact indicating here how expressionist this novel is going to be. So this description alone makes it clear that the expressionist concept of the novel, shaped by the emotional turmoil of his main character, foregrounding inner havoc of characters, overwhelmed by an incomprehensible and malicious world, is typical of expressionist art. Edvard Munch's painting, The Scream, illustrates this very, very well, very visually. Okay, so it's you remember the scream, the red sky pressing in on this almost skeletal character. That is a sense of expressionism. So this is what we need to bear in mind as we walk through these novels. Frequently, expressionist work reflected the experience of life in big cities. A famous example of this is Alfred Döblin's 1929 novel entitled Berlin-Alexanderplatz. However, O'Flaherty's Dublin novels predate Döblin. The Informer is set in the circles of the working class and the lumpenproletariat. It is about murderers, about prostitutes, about the police, escape, violence, gangs. Like Berlin-Alexanderplatz, it is written in the dialect of the capital's working class. So that is also useful to note, okay? They speak like Dublin working class people. In Berlin-Alexanderplatz, they speak like the Berliner working class. So that is important. Both novels are written cinematically. Remember, cinema is only just becoming an art form, black and white, silent at that time, but both of them write with cinema in mind, and you can see that when you read the novels. Berlin-Alexanderplatz, the German novel, is often compared to Joyce's Ulysses, but it has far more in common with O'Flaherty's The Informer than with Joyce's petty bourgeois world. As is clear from O'Flaherty's own description, the focus is on a character who falls into an existential crisis. There are aspects of the subconscious and impulsive, but also a basic decency as well as rationality and goodness in other characters. Like Berlin-Alexanderplatz, The Informer captures the heterogeneity of the working class of the time. The novel is set in Dublin, in the Dublin slums of post-Civil War Dublin, 1920s. Readers are introduced to the lumpenproletariat as well as to sections of the proletariat of this post-revolutionary period. Jippo Nolan, he described him in the letter to his publisher, Jippo Nolan, a man of great physical strength but limited intellectual capacity, lives here when he can afford a bed in a hostel. He is a good friend of Frankie McPhilip, and both had been members of the revolutionary organization until McPhillips killed the secretary of the local branch of the Farmers' Union during the farmer strike in a non-specified place, it says M, the previous October. Just to say, the Farmers' Union was an actual agrarian political party in the Irish Free State between 22 and 32, so at the time of writing this union, this party existed. The revolutionary organization, upon this killing, expelled both McPhillips and Jippo. Frankie, the man who did the killing, had been on the run in the mountains ever since. The Farmers' Union has offered a reward for information leading to his capture. Consumptive, McPhillips returns to Dublin on the day the novel is set, on the 15th of May in 1920-something, to secretly see his parents again. Due to his betrayal by Jippo, he comes under police fire at his parents' house and dies by his own gunshot wound. Something goes wrong with the gun. Jippo soon comes under suspicion, is arrested by the revolutionary organization, convicted, and eventually killed. Although the action is mainly confined to the hours after the betrayal, O'Flaherty creates a larger framework through his inclusion of quotations primarily from the communist press in the United States. The inclusion of such fictional communist sources was unprecedented in Irish literature. There had been nothing like this ever before. O'Flaherty does this for the first time in The Informer. And it is an indication of his older brother's, Tom's role in the CPUSA. Why should it be the CPUSA that he's quoting? So there is that nod to Tom here, for whose press Liam himself wrote from time to time. There are also references to the Communist International. Again, everything is fictional. The dubious leader of the revolutionary organization, Comrade Gallagher, believes that Jippo and McPhilip were drunk when they, which led to the shooting of the Farmers' Union secretary. And now I quote, for the first time, it was discovered that the revolutionary organization had spread its influence among the farm labourers and over the whole country. Something had been discovered. A government secret organization had overlapped the communist organization, and there was a little effervescence which was immediately suppressed by the government. Very little leaked out publicly. The newspapers were forbidden to talk about it. The conservative organs in Dublin had timid editorials demanding that the government should take the people into its confidence. End of quote. This extract alone proves O'Flaherty's lack of historical accuracy about the Irish communist movement. Its influence was never widespread among the population. O'Flaherty humorously gives the early communist movement in Ireland, in which he himself was instrumentally involved, such an ironized central role in the novel. Jippo is penniless and hungry when he meets Frankie. I quote, Jippo had not heard a word of what McPhilip is telling him. A monstrous idea had prowled into his head, like an uncouth beast, straying from a wilderness into a civilized place where little children are alone. He did not hear McPhilip's words or his coughing, although the monstrous idea was in relation to McPhilip's. End of quote. O'Flaherty does not need to spell out this idea. His description of Jippo's hunger and misery makes it clear what leads to the most unspeakable and terrible crime imaginable in Ireland, informing. As Jippo rushes to collect the reward and then, haunted by guilt, wanders the city spending the reward money on the slum dwellers, readers learn about Ireland's poorest class. O'Flaherty portrays this class as possessing little revolutionary potential. Despite the creation of the Free State, the police are still seen as the great enemy of the revolutionary organization, and the working class, as depicted in this novel, has nothing but fear and contempt for them. However, O'Flaherty depicts a class that has not reached the maturity for revolutionary change. Interestingly, Sinn Féin does not feature in the world of the novel. The armed and violent individuals belong to the Communist Party. And I just want to say again, there is a huge amount of irony in this fact. Just as the suggestion of a mass base among the population, the suggestion of a paramilitary organization that also does not correspond to the historical reality of the early Irish Communist Party. However, O'Flaherty is clearly and ironically alluding to this party here. The word communist crops up regularly, as do certain identifiable ideas, such as atheism or ideas on marriage espoused by this Gallagher, the head of this organization. O'Flaherty shows that this communist organization is part of an international movement that has its own views on the state of the Irish party. These critical views are quoted in the novel and contribute to the satire. The novel's portrayal of the organization in question, the novel's portrayal of the organization raises questions about the narrator. How omniscient is the narrator? Who often distances himself, even speaks disparagingly about this movement. Is this an unreliable narrator, or simply an aspect of satire in this mainly tragic novel? Now, I just want to, for those who aren't continuously reading about these things, an omniscient narrator is the one who knows what the what the author knows and describes things as the author sees them. An unreliable narrator is somebody the author invents and writes from that person's perspective. And it is not what the author thinks, but I'm sure you all know Swift's A Modest Proposal or Gulliver's Travels. You all know that, of course, this is not Swift speaking, but this unreliable narrator. I think this might be Shawnee coming, yeah. Shawnee? Yeah, okay. And Alan, please come in.
Sorry, we're late.
So, and it's a common enough trick. Dostoevsky did the same with The Idiot and so on and so forth. So, O'Flaherty does use an unreliable narrator at times, and here we're not sure. It's not clear, okay, but there are aspects of it. So, and perhaps, anyway, the narrator in The Informer cannot simply be identified with O'Flaherty's view. He is having a laugh in it, okay? But it is also partly a tragic novel when we watch what happens to Jippo and why it happens and so on and the whole thing. Anyway, perhaps it is on this unstable ground where we cannot be sure about this narrator that there is an aspect of modern narration of the modern novel that we just don't know, okay? Anyway, while the left revolutionary movement is portrayed as an immature movement, satirically, it is widely accepted within the working class. Its individual members consistently lack understanding, sometimes commitment, and occasionally they simply act out of fear of the dictatorial Galahad. It is typical of O'Flaherty's novel of the 1920s that there is no hero. The potential of this class is not to be found in a single character, but it is widespread across several people, especially women. These include slum dwellers and prostitutes, Connemara Maggie and Katie Fox, as well as Frankie's mother Maggie and his sister Mary, who is part of the employed working class, albeit with aspirations for social advancement. Mary McPhillips, the sister of the dead man, appeals to Galahad several times not to shoot Jippo, and even points out that her own brother has also killed a man, and she says, please don't kill Jippo. But about Frankie's father then, the narrator has this to say. Frank McPhillip, and I quote, Frank McPhillip the bricklayer had already begun the ascent from the working class to the middle class. He was a socialist and chairman of his branch of the trade union, but a thoroughly respectable, conservative socialist, utterly fanatical in his hatred of the status of a working man. The whole house was in keeping with his views on life. End of quote. Frankie's mother not only recognizes that Jippo is intellectually challenged, she has also been generous to him in the past and understands poverty and hunger as the cause of his actions. She even forgives him when he confesses that he betrayed her son, saying, quote, I forgive you, you didn't know what you were doing. O'Flaherty describes abject poverty in this novel. Again, it is a woman, Biddy Burke, who runs a brothel in the working class district, who voices the realization that society has not changed since independence. And I would now ask you to forgive my non-existent Dublin working class accent. This is written in the Dublin working class accent. I will not even attempt to go there. The country is going to the wall. That's all there's to it. I knew they'd make a mess of it with their revolutions and their shooting the peelers. Not that I didn't do me bit to help the boys, God bless them. But 'tisn't the boys that done the fighting that get the jobs, so it isn't. It never is if you ask Biddy Burke. It's them politicians and bishops that were always top dog in this country. 'Twas that way before, 'tis that way again now, and it will be that way when Biddy Burke is going to meet her God on the day of judgment. End of quote. So Jippo acts from hunger. Hunger makes him an informer. However, having betrayed his comrade, guilt-ridden, he cannot live with himself. He spends his entire reward of £20 at that time, was a lot of money, on the poor in an Italian snack bar. And he pays for a prostitute to go home to England and settles her supposed bill with the owner of the brothel. He gives money to the prostitutes Connemara Maggie and Katie Fox. The only money he spends on himself is on food and whiskey In the last hours of his life, he manages not to go hungry, but at a huge cost. This 1925 instant bestseller is the first of O'Flaherty's Dublin novels to deal with the early years of the Irish Free State. Little, if anything, had changed since independence, and for O'Flaherty there was no unified, organised workers' party to lead the people out of this misery. In one of the other Dublin novels, The Assassin, O'Flaherty continues the idea that guns continue to play a role in Irish politics in the 1920s. Two other novels, The Puritan and Mr. Gilhooly, deal with the Catholic Church's fatal control over people's thinking. And we now move on to Mr. Gilhooly. So, Mr. Gilhooly followed a year after The Informer in 1926. One of the very powerful ways in which the ideals of the revolutionary years were suppressed and eventually all but replaced was by elevating the Catholic Church to the commanding heights of the new state. O'Flaherty comments on this centrally in all his novels, but it is a main theme in Mr. Gilhooly and the Puritan. Mr. Gilhooly was written as the Catholic Church was increasingly taking control of the social sphere and the so-called moral purity of the Irish people. New organizations set up during this decade reflect this: the Legion of Mary, the Central Catholic Library, the Guild of Catholic Nurses, Anriacht, the Knights of Columbanus, the Modest Dress and Deportment Crusade, the Catholic Truth Society, the Catholic Protection and Rescue Society of Ireland, the CYMS, and the Ancient Order of Hibernians. In the 1930s and 40s, the 1930s and 40s also witnessed the establishment of new organizations, including the League for Social Justice, the Guild of Regnum Christi, Muncha Natira, the Irish Christian Front, Christus Rex, Maria Duce. The CTSI campaigned successfully for censorship legislation. In Mr. Gilhooly, O'Flaherty shifts his setting away from the working class and the politics of the revolutionary period to the middle class. Briefly, the novel is set in the immediate present. Larry Gilhooly, a 49-year-old civil engineer, recently returned from working in South America and now retired on an income of £700 per annum, cannot find a suitable job in construction in Ireland. I think it's a bit metaphorical that it is construction. He can't find a job in, as in building a new society, all of that kind of thing. He can't find a job. He doesn't have the connections to marry a socially suitable spouse. He spends the day walking aimlessly around Dublin, and his pub mates include the writer Michael Ward and Seamus Hanrahan. His life suddenly takes a new direction when he is approached by the hungry, freezing, homeless 22-year-old Nellie Fitzpatrick, a workhouse orphan from Galway. Gilhooly takes her for a meal and then to his room in a lodging house. Soon she is discovered by the maid Sissy, and Gilhooly is thrown out of his lodgings. Church indoctrination has affected the working class. I'm talking about Sissy now, the cleaner in the house, as well as the lower middle class, the owners of the lodging house. The owner is an ex-policeman, retired after the disbandment of the RSC. Cohabitation with a tart is so unacceptable that the pair must be ejected at all cost to maintain respectability. Gilhooly knows his connection with Nellie is ruinous for his reputation and puts out the rumour that he plans to marry her next week. The fact that she is unmarried and living with Gilhooly suffices to make her socially undesirable and earn her the title of whore. Gilhooly is attracted to her and willing to come to some kind of an arrangement. He rents a flat from a prosperous, middle-class acquaintance, the notorious womanizer Michael Friel, whose family, quote, has lately become rather high officials in the new government. Despite seducing Nellie himself, he wants the couple out of his flat immediately, again on moral grounds. Here, as in other novels, O'Flaherty emphasizes the connection between church, business and government. No one in the novel takes Nellie's side. Even Gilhooly is terrified of ruining his reputation. So while O'Flaherty draws Nellie realistically and with sympathy, similar to his portrayal of prostitutes in The Informer, none of his mainly middle-class characters rise above this social diktat. In his portrayal of Gilhooly, O'Flaherty shows one whose mind slowly descends into madness. Madness is a common theme in expressionist art. Other examples from expressionist German cinema are the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or the Dracula adaptation Nosferatu. Realistic writing, in the eyes of this movement, of the expressionist movement, could not adequately capture society's great threat to sanity. I think we can even feel that again today, you know? Isn't there that sense of we're descending into insanity? And this is something that was felt very much 100 years ago, and this is when this expressionist movement was very powerful in Europe. But Gilhooly is also descending into madness because he cannot stand what the society is actually, he can't live with himself, he can't live with this contradiction that the society is imposing on him. So Gilhooly's madness may be seen in a similar social context. He becomes very jealous and suspicious. And as Gilhooly's violent thoughts increase, O'Flaherty's writing, interestingly, becomes more expressionist as these thoughts take over Gilhooly's mind. So I'm now going to quote another little piece to show you what this expressionism sounds like, okay? In terrible agony, he searched the heavens for God, and finding none, he sought devils to destroy the universe and make a void. And finding nothing to heed the desire of his imagination, he was forced back to earth again, out of this universal emptiness, to contemplate his kind that pursued him, and he knew them now as he had never known them, not as beings with names and personalities, but as living parts of himself, each with a face like his own. And he addressed them all, appealing with craven submissiveness for their mercy, and his mind saw no face softened with pity. But in all faces he saw his own face, horrible with the mark of guilt. In all faces he saw the ugliness of his own face. His mind knew that he had brought it to their faces. So you see a man and his mind descending into madness, but the kind of the root cause behind it all is a social one, and what this has brought him to, killing Nelly. Although this novel is not set in the working class, the unemployed and the destitute are never far away from the centre of the novel. You will not find one single O'Flaherty novel where the working class does not appear. This time it's taking a backseat, but it is present. And so, for example, in chapter 8, a demonstration of the unemployed takes place. Nelly herself is a workhouse brat raised on charity, quote. Despite this novel being the first of O'Flaherty's to depart from a working class setting, he still places the action in a context that includes this class. The position characters took in the recent Civil War is also a hallmark of his novels of the time, and Gilhooly is shown to be a supporter of the pro-treaty forces and the state that emerged from it. Mr. Gilhooly reveals early on, a mere 3 years into the state's existence, not only that the fact of an overpowering Catholic ethos, but the complete complicity of the middle class. Gilhooly has an unformed desire to break out of this, and it should be noted that he himself is not a religious man. His failure to do so underscores the grip of this moral diktat on an overwhelming part of the population. Next novel to appear is The Assassin. On the 10th of July 1927, just before noon, Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Justice since 1922, was killed by 3 gunmen on his way to Mass. The 3 gunmen were anti-treaty IRA members who shot him for his role in the execution of 77 Republican prisoners during the Civil War. They acted on their own, and they were never charged or apprehended for this assassination. They were Archie Doyle, Bill Gannon, and Tim Coughlan. Bill Gannon, one of them, later said, I quote, "You can have no idea what it was like with the memory of the executions and the sight of him just walking along on his own. We started shooting from the car, then getting out of the car, we continued to shoot. We all shot at him, he didn't have a chance." End of quote. 2 days after the killing, on the 12th of July 1927, O'Flaherty mentions his plans to write a novel entitled The Assassin in a letter to his publisher Edward Garnett, saying he would commence work this autumn. The manuscript was ready in early January 1928, so he spent about 6 months, even less perhaps, writing this. O'Flaherty focuses on one of his own fictional assassins. So the difference between history and literature is that it isn't one of those three assassins. It is a character that he has invented himself. Okay, so it's not one of the actual three assassins that we're talking about. His name is Michael McDara, who we hear escaped from prison 3 years ago. He masterminds the operation and wins 2 fellow Republicans, Dan McFetridge, called Gutty Fetch, and Tumulty to his cause. Another former comrade involved in the novel is Kitty Mellor, who obtains the crucial information, thereby paving the way for the assassination. She has been an officer in the Women's Army, carried guns, gone to jail. The narrative point of view is third person limited. What does this mean? So it isn't an I narrator, it isn't a first person narrator, it isn't an unreliable narrator who pretends to be an omniscient narrator. This is somebody who writes about he and she did this and that and they did this, but he writes primarily from one of these people's points of view. So he takes on, so O'Flaherty is writing from McDara's point of view, so this makes it a limited third-person narrator, okay? So we only really see not a whole lot more than what McDara thinks and how he sees. So, now, while McDara isn't one of the actual assassins, historical assassins, what is evident, though, is that the assassinated person, the victim of the assassination, is meant to be Kevin O'Higgins. There are a lot of things that point towards that fact, as I will show. While this is made clear not only in the similarities between the shooting, as depicted in the novel, and the facts of the day that we heard, it is obvious in other ways too. There are several references that the target is a key player in the existing government. This is particularly apparent when Kitty goes to the Shelbourne Hotel to extract the crucial intelligence of when this politician can be reliably found unarmed in routine business, and we'll now hear what she observes as these government officials enter the hotel. They include, and now I quote, Timothy McShiel TD, a member of the government party. He was always trying to sit on the fence, waiting to jump in one side or waiting to jump in on the side of the winning team, but he was waiting on the fence to see. In private, he gave the imperialist element to understand that he was at heart an imperialist. He had become rich since the establishment of the new government by manipulating the first-hand knowledge he received of budgets, of new companies that were being subsidized, and of industries that were going to be protected. He was an ardent Catholic. End of quote. Also part of the party is the Labour leader, Tyneham, who worries about being seen by Kitty in the company of Jenkins, a rich man, a capitalist and imperialist, and thinks, quote, it'll be all over town tomorrow that I was seen drunk at the Shelbourne Hotel, smoking cigars, wasting the workers' money, and being bought by government and Freemasons. End of quote. And finally, and here we come to this fascist character, the one who points to Kevin O'Higgins. He works in the Department of Justice, the Ministry of Justice. And finally, there is Tom Carmody, an official in the Ministry of Justice and former officer in the Free State Army during the Civil War. Again, this little reference, he was in the Free State Army during the Civil War, who voices fascist opinions, stating that the country needs, what the country needs is a man who, and I quote, rises up and tries to hammer our people into shape, to mold the country into self-respect, to discipline a nation of slaves. We need the iron heel. And by God, we'll have it too. He's going to give it to you. End of quote. It is noteworthy that O'Flaherty detects this fascist zeitgeist as early as the late 1920s. The fact, this is before Hitler, you remember, the fact that Carmody, this guy from the Ministry of Justice, represents the Ministry of Justice, points clearly to Kevin O'Higgins. This scene, with its precise political settings of characters in terms of business links to Catholicism, political leanings, is typical for O'Flaherty. The Civil War still looms large in the backgrounds of people, and they're defined by the positions they took. This was true of Mr. Gilhooly too, although not as central to that novel as it is here. There can be no doubt regarding O'Flaherty's anti-treaty position. The middle class are clearly portrayed as the enemy of the people who are largely impoverished, hungry, betrayed, and at their mercy, a leitmotif of O'Flaherty's work. While the historical gunmen's motive for killing O'Higgins is clear, we heard he had overseen the assassination of 77 Republican prisoners. The motive for the characters in the novel is much less clear. It's not as political as that. We'll come to that. O'Flaherty uses the third-person limited narrator. So the use of the third-person limited narrator must not be confused with his own understanding of the event. Okay? So MacDara, the central character, sees less clearly the reasons for his action, which causes him serious agonizing over his plans, both before and after the event. A discussion among the assassins reveals the assassins' differing reasons and expectations of the outcomes. Tumulty hopes the assassinations will get the people to rise and lead to revolution. That is why he is involved. MacDara has no such hopes and appears to be more realistic in his assessment. He asks Tumulty, who's going to make the revolution? And Tumulty answers, I've got 10 men. MacDara says, I don't want the people to rise. I am not a communist. And Kitty voices her own assessment in another context when she says, it's going to be the same as before. The people are not going to rise. You should have seen them at the Shelbourne. Carmody, McShiel and Tynan, they have no souls. They are as cold as ice. They just laugh at us. They'll exploit anything that happens. Carmody is just like the man that's going to be slaughtered. Or he or someone else will step into the dead man's shoes. So Kitty has the most understanding of the situation. She's seen Carmody. She knows who's waiting in the wings to take the place of the dead man. What's the point of this assassination is what she's saying. Nevertheless, she does her bit and it happens. So here O'Flaherty implies his own view that there is no revolutionary situation, and indeed the other characters agree. MacDara says, there's no revolutionary movement in the country. And Tumulty agrees, that's well known. Compared to the informer, there is less indication of any kind of revolutionary organization or will among the people. Even the three assassins come from disparate backgrounds in a conflicted movement. Gutty Fetch is a turncoat. Tumulty was expelled from the organization for causing rank disruption. MacDara himself, although he still knows them, has contacts, has been away from the movement, and the assassination is his own plan, not that of the movement. MacDara's reasons for planning the assassinations are less clear and seem close to religious fanaticism. He says to Kitty, I'm doing this because I want to be free, to cut every cord. It's only when a man cuts every cord that he approaches the nearest thing to being a god. To Tumulty, he voices another motive. Our business is not to cripple England, but to create a superior type of human being here. That is the objective of the revolutionary. End of quote. In a very expressionist sense, there are several references to two personalities in MacDara. Remember the madness, yeah? Now two personalities in him. One sheds tears, praying, howling out to God, I'm quoting, and the other scowled and thought, use force, be violent, end of quote. The former anxious aspect of MacDara's personality dominates his qualms and fears throughout the book. This focus on the turmoil in one of the three assassins' minds, the telling of the story from his limited, emotionally expressive perspective, gives the novel its expressionist character. It is in this context that O'Flaherty's comment about the nature of the assassin in his letter to Garnet, to the publisher, is of particular interest. My contention, I quote, my contention is that the complex of assassination is the result of temporary insanity, and that the reaction in a general type leads to normality. In other words, that intellectual and moral despair produces the complex of assassination. That's what O'Flaherty says. Intellectual and moral despair produces the complex of assassination. So we're back to this connection between what's going on in society, madness, and then this despair that leads to assassination. Here O'Flaherty states clearly the expressionist approach, where social or class analysis is not to the fore. So he is not analysing society, he's not saying this is what happens. He is giving us this through the emotions of this third person character, that Magdala. So it's more implied rather than stated factually and outright. In contrast to Mr. Gilhooly, however, the novel is set once again firmly in the working class and the characters speak as working class Dubliners do. Only Kitty comes from an upper middle class family background, people who are staunchly with the ruling class, but she has been cut off by the people. She has been thrown out of her family. Following the assassin, O'Flaherty published several works in 1929, Return of the Brute, a powerful modern anti-war novel, A Tourist Guide to Ireland, and of course The House of Gold. It is also the year in which the censorship board took up its activity and began banning books on Ireland, beginning with O'Flaherty's The House of Gold. So we move on to The House of Gold. Liam Mellows, imprisoned and executed by the Irish Free State forces during the Civil War, wrote in a prison letter dated 25th of August. That's just 2 days ago, isn't it? 100 years ago. He says, and I quote, "In our efforts to win back public support for the Republic as in the sense of 1916, we are forced to recognize, whether we like it or not, that the commercial interests and the Gombeen man are on the side of the treaty. We are back to toll, which is just as well, relying on that great body, the men of no property. The stake in the country people were never with the Republic." End of quote. The House of Gold is set in the fictional city of Barra, easily recognized as Galway. The significance of the novel is that it exemplifies for Ireland, and by extension, other post-colonial countries. I think this is really important. I'll just say it again. The importance of the novel is that it exemplifies not only for Ireland and the whole of Ireland, not just for Galway, for Ireland, but also other post-colonial countries. How the corrupt new native bourgeoisie, led by the money and power-hungry Raymond Moore Costello and his clerical accomplices, replaced the British ruling class. The House of Gold is the only O'Flaherty novel in which a Gombeen man plays a central role. Although this character was inspired by a certain Galway businessman, you all know who I'm talking about, O'Flaherty states unequivocally in the novel, I quote, "In every little town in Ireland, you will find a man like Raymond Moore." End of quote. Raymond Moore is a Common na Gael politician who draws his wealth from the predominantly rural proletariat, robbing the town of Barra and its environs from their wealth and hopes for the future. The novel plot takes place over 24 hours. It follows a series of main characters: Raymond Moore Costello, his unhappy, beautiful wife Nora, her lover Francis O'Neill, who shares some traits with Liam O'Flaherty, the doctor Jim Fitzgerald, and a whole host of people connected to them, including the police. The action begins at midnight with a rendezvous between Francis O'Neill and Nora. It follows Nora's alleged rape by a priest, her attempts to break away from Raymond and his family, Raymond's business dealings, a public meeting, a robbery, and at least 2 deaths. This sounds like a thriller, but the novel's 21 chapters focus less on the background plot and more on the characters, their motivations, and their relationship with Raymond Moore. The scenes showing people from all walks of life are full of conversation and energy. They are individual, vivid, dramatic. The social panorama of the city unfolds as everyone is shown in their dependence on the tyrant, Raymond Moore. This dependence leads some of the characters, such as Father Considine, to despair, and once again, almost to madness. Other characters suffer due to their weakness, their inability to stand up to Raymond Moore. Apart from Father Considine, these include the doctor, Raymond's sister, and Nora, who are unable to stand up to Raymond Moore. Events do not follow a strictly chronological plotline, but take a back seat to the relationships that develop over the course of the novel. Once again, there are no heroes, no characters with whom the reader is expected to identify, but instead, In Brecht's sense, I'll just explain that in a second. In Brecht's sense, the reader is kept at an emotional distance. Now, I just want to explain that in case not everybody is that familiar with Brecht. Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright of the 20th century, he developed this, he wasn't on his own, but he developed very much the theory of keeping an audience, he's a dramatist largely, at an emotional distance, so that the audience would see what was happening on the stage without identifying with someone in particular, and observe what was going on, why it was going on, what caused this to go on, and to think about the society that produces this. This is Brecht's kind of the kernel of Brecht's thinking. And Shakespeare does this at times as well. So it wasn't his invention, but he very much developed this. And O'Flaherty does something very similar. We do not identify with anybody in that novel, and we are made to think much more about how they all relate to Raymond Moore, why they do what they're doing, or why they don't do what they're doing. It's largely about people not managing to do anything against him. So I'll just read that sentence again. Once again, there are no heroes, no characters with whom the reader is expected to identify. Instead, in Brecht's sense, the reader is kept at an emotional distance, encouraged to view the scenes with a detachment that allows for critical thinking and reflection. The reader sees the characters and their relationships as they are, unimpeded by emotional identification. O'Flaherty proves himself here, once more, to be part of the European avant-garde, and must be seen in the context of Brecht and other left-wing modern literary figures of the time. So, for O'Flaherty, the essence of post-independence, the Irish Free State, was that the new Irish bourgeoisie simply followed in the footsteps of the English and Anglo-Irish landlords. They have literally moved into their mansions and continue to exploit the working people. Francis O'Neill says to Nora about Raymond Moore and the house he has moved into. He says to her, and I quote, "That house you're living in now once belonged to Sir Michael de Burgo. He was the landowner around here. He was a tyrant and an enemy of the people. But he was 7 times better than the man that's there now, because after all it was not his own class and his own flesh he was eating, same as Raymond Moore is doing. In the last rising, I and the likes of me put the finishing touches to the landlord class, fighting with the whole country against us, while Raymond Moore lay low, waiting to see how the cat would jump, and by God, at the same time making money out of our blood by selling rations to the soldiers we were fighting. And when it was all over and we won, he stole into that empty house and grabbed the land we fought for." End of quote. Raymond Moore Costello and many of his kind have been damaged by the times they themselves created, robbed of their humanities in many ways, and have lost touch with themselves and their fellow human beings. On this metaphorical level, O'Flaherty shows that independence has not led to a freer society. Yes, Raymond Moore has money and power in the new state, but even his wealth is shabby. His political power only serves to increase his power over his own people and make them miserable. Their lives are no different from before. Little has changed or improved. Moreover, the Catholic Church is never far away from Raymond Moore or independent of him. The doctor comments, I quote, "The Church is more sacred than the law, and the citizen has very few rights where the clergy are concerned," end of quote. And Father Considine says to Costello, I quote, "It was I suggested you going into politics. It was I planned your campaign for you. It was I protected you during the revolution. I even became your accomplice in murder. Don't you remember," he says in a low voice, "when that ship was wrecked on the sands? You bought the wreck. It had a cargo of grain on board. You sold the rotten grain and made thousands of pounds on it. It lay there for months while the people took the grain. The stench of that rotten grain brought a fever on the town. 20 people died in the fishermen's quarter. I defended you at the inquiry. I perjured myself. It was perjury. It was murder. Murder." Many of the impoverished people who live in the mountains are emigrating. These are Francis O'Neill's people. He meets them on their way to town, among them a tall man who sees through it all. So now I'm quoting what this tall man from the mountain says. Who'd stay on these rocks but a lunatic working for Raymond Moore Costello? There's nowhere else to go for them but to America. Aren't they flying every day as if there were a plague in the country? Soon there'll be nobody left. And that miser down there, that grabber Raymond Moore, is the cause of it. He has ruined the country, my curse on him. The villagers see small boats from the Aran Islands, here we are, coming into Galway harbour. These are Raymond Moore's people. So Raymond Moore, in the book, very much like the guy he's based on, McDonough, originated from here. So anyway, these people are coming into Galway harbour, and there is another encounter, this time between Raymond and his own folk. The parallel character to the big man we just heard from in the previous scene is called Tommy Duran. He is, I quote, a well-known figure a fellow in the district because of his strange conversation and his demented wit. He was terrifying in appearance because of his wild, restless eyes, his pale face, his sudden grin, his hunched shoulders, his bobbing chin, and the twitching of his limbs. He was dressed in island costume. He was tall, large-boned, lean, terribly vital, a typical islander. And now this man Duran says, I quote again, "The rich man turns everything into gold, for he is wise and he has no pity for the hunger of an empty stomach. He has no conscience. He doesn't see the misery of the poor, for he has a magic veil over his eyes. He is deaf and blind like God, who made hell as well as heaven." End of quote. It is the common people, and we saw it in the Informer as well. Remember Biddy Burke? It is the common people who see through Raymond Moore completely, understanding his nature, and know that they can neither trust him nor expect to be treated any better than they were under de Burgo. Duran and the big man in the scene before represent this potential of the people. Both have energy and insight. They are fearless, and yet they are isolated. There's only the two of them. Both are seen as outsiders, and the majority of the people around them are subservient to Raymond. Now I say there's only two of them, and they are alone in their communities, but there are two of them, and they are in different places. And maybe they can come together, if you know what I mean. There is a certain small degree of hope there. Yet, So there seems to be little comparable, so they have the insight. There seems to be little comparable insight among the townspeople. The town is impoverished, neglected, the inhabitants succumbing to a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness. There's no sign of the energy and the anger that we see in the people of the rural outposts. The middle-class characters in the novel are ineffectual and often too afraid of Raymond and his power to act decisively. This fear impacts on a latent resentment that fails to spark into rebellion. At a public meeting, we come across proposals for change and reactions from different people of the middle class: the solicitor, the doctor, the proprietor of the railway hotel, Finnegan, the businessman Fogarty. The solicitor Fitzpatrick addresses the meeting and says that the people of Barra, quote, must root out the cancer that is eating into the hearts of their social life, end of quote. While Fitzpatrick had insight, the reader has no indication that this will lead anywhere. Bob Finnerty, the Labour Union organiser, speaks against him, saying, quote, "It's not people like you who are going to be free, who are going to free the people from oppression. It's up to the working class." While all of this is going on, the doctor arrives at the conclusion that he, and now he really gives up, it's quite a sad thing, I quote, that he was really equipped for leading an analytical life, for accepting reality and for influencing his fellow creatures towards the pursuit of beauty by moving inwards on his own soul. There's no action anyway to be expected from there. Little hope for real change comes from any of these people. The police too, it is suggested, are in Raymond Moore's pocket. Too great is the combined power of church and state. When the doctor suggests setting up a library, the townspeople comment, I quote, "How are you going to have a library when Father Considine come and burn the books? Not that I want a library, that man Raymond Moore has the sound sucked dry. Along with taking the people's money, he has taken their hearts as well," end of quote. The hearts that struggled for independence have been taken away by this unholy alliance. And because there is no visible change to colonial times, the people give up hope. We know this, people stop voting, don't they? The same thing. The ideals of 1916, even the ideals of 1921, have been betrayed. Instead, the Free State has become a neo-colonial backwater ruled by the gombeen and created a system where even access to literature and thought is censored. No hero, no one person who really grasps the situation tries to change it. The central character is a villain. All the other important characters are middle class and weak, highly unlikely leaders. These have to be sought among the people, Francis O'Neill's own people, whom he meets coming from the mountains, Tommy Duran from Arran, who directly challenges Raymond Moore. However, they are marginal. The majority of the people we meet seem traumatized by the loss of the ideals of a society where all the children of the nation are treated equally, as promised in the Easter Proclamation. The absence of a unifying force that could bring about change also defines the realism of O'Flaherty's work. There is a sense of petrification. O'Flaherty has captured this time in his work like no other. You will be pleased to hear we're moving on to the last book, The Puritan. The fifth and final novel to deal with the immediate present of the Free State is The Puritan, published in 1932. In some respects, it goes back over similar territory to Mr. Gilhooly, but The Puritan takes in a wider scope. Yes, on the very upper level of the plot, it is another novel about the killing of a prostitute by a middle-class man who suffers from insanity. However, it delves more deeply into the fabric of the society from which it arises. The novel is at least as much about this society as it is about the crime. In The Puritan, O'Flaherty once more uses the crime thriller genre to explore the issues of Catholic vigilance groups, the banning and burning of books, and the makeup of the middle class that tolerates all of this. The middle class that has now assumed power continues to be in the dock and edged ever more sharply. It must be remembered that while O'Flaherty was writing The Puritan in 1931, apart from the newly established censorship board, with its immediate clampdown on novels deemed unsuitable for the Irish readership, Ireland was readying itself for the Eucharistic Congress of 1932. The Puritan was published on the 25th of January 1932 and of course immediately banned by the censorship board. On the 26th of February, so a month later, in the Manchester Guardian published a letter by William Butler Yeats written in protest against the banning of The Puritan. Yeats wrote, and I quote, "The book is an Irish Tartuffe, and in Molière's Tartuffe, a contemporary movement was satirized which nobody thinks about today. I think it is probable that if the censors were to examine their consciences, they would discover that those consciences were biased by the fact that The Puritan, in its external superficial aspect, is a satire on a movement which has produced the censorship board itself. From the point of view of that movement, their ban is wild folly, for it turns a lamp into a bomb. The book will come secretly into Ireland, go from man to man as if it belonged to some hidden religion. And if I am right in my belief that this is a great book, it will so travel for generations to come." Like Larry Gilhooly, the protagonist in The Puritan, Francis Ferreter, is a man of middle-class background. Ferreter, like Gilhooly, kills in a frenzy of jealousy-induced madness. Much more so than Gilhooly, Ferreter is clearly conditioned by social prejudices against prostitutes and other aspects considered unclean by the Catholic hierarchy. However, there are further important differences between the books, which were written about 5 years apart. The plot of Mr. Gilhooly is largely restricted to the protagonist and his world. As we saw, it is written in the third-person limited point of view, not really revealing much beyond the narrow perspective of Mr. Gilhooly himself. And as Gilhooly descends into madness, the writing becomes increasingly expressionist. In The Puritan, O'Flaherty uses an omniscient narrator. This is somebody who knows everything and can usually be identified with the author. One that knows more than the characters, has an all-knowing viewpoint and comments on a wider picture. O'Flaherty employs no expressionist writing either. He presents Féile's agonies in a more detached way. He shows Féile on the one hand as a man struggling with mental illness. He hallucinates, he has voices, has been hospitalized. On the other hand, he is deeply enmeshed with the Catholic vigilance groups and has been involved in arson attacks on bookshops. He also works as a journalist for the Catholic paper Morning Star and has ties with the publication Catholic Vanguard. In this book, written shortly after the setting up of the censorship board and the banning of some of O'Flaherty's novels, 5 novels in fact, among a great many others, not only O'Flaherty's novels were banned, but of course many novels by other Irish writers and international writers. I mean, I'm just repeating something other people have said, that the list on the index really is who is who and who to read in Ireland and abroad. So anyway, where was I? Yes. So it's written shortly after the setting up of the censorship board and the banning of some of Flaherty's novels, as well as those of many other Irish and international writers. He exposes the hypocritical nature of a society that allows, facilitates, and exploits the control of the Catholic Church over people's lives. Féile's circumstances predestine him to become involved with these fascist forces. There are people who reject the clerical hold on of the Catholic Church on society, like, for example, Féile's brother-in-law. There are more people who arrange themselves with it opportunistically, though. Interestingly, in 1931, before Hitler took power in Germany, O'Flaherty has this to say about Polish, who is the editor of the Catholic Vanguard, I quote, "He had a great influence on zealous young Catholic men of Féile's type. These latter regarding him as a sort of clerical Mussolini." End of quote. Although fascism is never the main theme of O'Flaherty's novels, there are repeated references in his work to the potential for fascism, as in The Assassin, for example. But the Puritan is not merely about the detrimental effect of fundamentalist Christianity. It is also a sharp analysis of the Catholic middle class as the new ruling class in the Irish Free State. Thus, the newspaper Morning Star is described as, I quote, "the property of a powerful group of Dublin businessmen, representative of that Catholic middle class that has risen to prosperity with the collapse of the land-owning class and the change from feudalism to democracy. During the armed struggle waged by this Catholic middle class against the British government from 1918 to 1921, and again during the Civil War waged in the 2 succeeding years by the new middle class rulers against the poorer peasants and labourers that wished to share the spoils of victory." So the middle class had this initial role of liberating, of helping to bring about independence, and then it turned on the class that was challenging this victory and saying, we want to be part of this. All the children of the nation should be treated equally. So, O'Flaherty then goes on to comment on what unfolded immediately after independence. I quote from the book, "Then the Free State government began to set the affairs of the country in order, ensuring peace and stability by rigid measures, without, however, introducing that utopia for the wretched common people, which had been promised by the Catholic middle class in its struggle for power. When Dr. Johnson said that patriotism was the last refuge of a scoundrel, he could not have meant his words to apply to Ireland. For in our country, that last refuge is religion. The Catholic clergy were starting their great campaign to consolidate their power under the new government." End of quote. In this way, the themes of growing clerical control as well as a conniving Catholic middle class are intertwined, and the close connection between the church and business is a theme that dominates all of O'Flaherty's novels, even his historical and semi-historical novels like The Martyr, which was written 10 years after the class war that was inherent in the Civil War. In that sense, the killings of Nellie in Mr. Garhuli, the killing of Teresa in The Puritan are also about the lethal violence of middle-class men against working-class women. The police officers are committed to bringing the murderer to justice, although the chief superintendent expresses sympathies for Féile's views. There are, however, working class characters, most notably the prostitutes, but also a group of slum dwellers who articulate their understanding of the new ruling class as an extension of British rule. Now I quote, "The crowd, being mainly composed of slum dwellers, was exceedingly violent against the murderer. They were of the opinion that an injury had been done to one of their class by some rich person. 2 women were shaking their fists at the police and saying there was one law for the rich and another for the poor. It must be understood that the economic conditions of that district had suffered considerably since the closing of the brothel quarter by the government after the revolution. For this reason, the crowd associated the police with the murder. Although among the poor, the police are never regarded as the upholders of the common law, but as agents for the rich who oppress those without property." End of quote. But apart from voicing these views, there is no active challenge to the system by these people that brought forth Féilte and his kind. In order to prevent a repetition of such outrages, the breeding ground needs to be removed, the root cause. There's no indication of this happening. So while there is insight, there's no action. In fact, Féilte himself points out the hypocrisy of the establishment which pervades the law. He says, and this is interesting coming from Féilte in those years, he says, "I hold very decided views about the evils of prostitution and consider that both parties to this immoral traffic are equally guilty, whereas in the eyes of the law, only the woman is guilty. I consider that the man should be punished equally with the woman, as he has shared in the guilt." So that's something. When delving into Féilte's background and childhood, I'm on my last page, half a page. When delving into Féilte's background and childhood, O'Flaherty also makes clear in the novel as early as this that child sexual abuse was rampant in schools run by religious orders. Féilte is a victim of this. O'Flaherty shows that Féilte cannot simply be dismissed as a madman, but must be seen as the product of a society that, if you take it by its very word, can drive you to insanity. So, O'Flaherty reinforces the class nature of Irish society in very many ways. But in The Puritan, like in The House of Gold, he makes devastating statements about this unholy alliance between the Catholic ruling class, business, the state, and the church in the betrayal of the working people. While this may not be as overtly stated in some of the other novels, it is nevertheless always present. The Irish working class are the great losers of Irish independence. The ideals they fought for have been replaced by a fundamentalist religious diktat and a capitalist class that has no regards for their needs. No way were all the children of the nation treated equally. They have gained neither independence or freedom. Thank you.
Jenny, I think that was a very, very well put together lecture. I have to say that coming through, I think you drew out the coherence in O'Flaherty's vision of the nature of the state and what was going on, the lack of challenge and so on. And it was also interesting that you situated this in European politics and European literature of the time, because O'Flaherty is his antennae are very much open to these things. So there's an awful lot, I think, an awful lot to be discussed from this. I also, you have given us some new readings, I think, of the novels, starting with The Informer, a new way of looking at sometimes when you're reading a novel, you just sort of go through the thing, sort of you carry on. Yeah. Whereas when you drew them out and you highlight these statements and particular extracts, I thought that was very. What emerges from that is very interesting. So we'll have a short question and answer session before we move on down to down for lunch. I'm sure Jenny's lecture has provoked plenty of thought, and there's already one hand up before I've even finished asking the audience for questions. Joseph.
Yeah. I was thinking of Pádraig Ó Conaill, who was a close relation and cousin even of Martin Moore. Now, Pádraig Ó Conaill, of course, was a socialist Irish language writer and he often criticised Martin Moore straight up. But he also supported the Free State at the beginning, at least. And then he wrote, mainly because of his friendship with Michael Collins in England. He had a high regard for Michael Collins, had Pádraig Ó Tuama, and he supported. But then he said, I supported the treaty, he says, but then I looked around me, and when I saw the people who were supporting it, I had doubts. You know, he copped on fairly quickly. Now, we know that there was a great friendship, deep friendship even, between Uí Fhlaithearta and Pádraig Ó Tuama. Very deep. And he liked Pádraig Ó Tuama. We have that story of when he wrote Críomhléacht na Cruinne, Pádraig Ó Tuama, and Liam translated it to English and sent it to a magazine in England. And he said that the state was treating him badly anyway. But he sent off the short story in translation, and he got £2 for it. And he gave it to Pádraig, he said. And according to Liam, who might have exaggerated, Pádraig lit his pipe with it, with the £2. I don't believe that, because he wouldn't have a lot of money back then. Anyway, that friendship we should look into at a later stage with Pádraig Ó Tuama, and as that Martin O'Kane, they were good friends. And that we should look at that from the Irish language side. Anyway, this is the question. Very few Irish people would have read the novels, if you consider that they were banned, some of them. The House of Gold was banned until Thomas the Musmachimon reissued it for us. So not a lot of people in Ireland would have read them, which was sad. And that brings us on to today's times. Are there any books like that being written, novels now, discussing Irish society, or, you know, analysing? I don't know, I don't read novels, I don't like novels at all. I don't. And Bob Quinn gave me a lecture at one time. I remember we were coming from America at the plane, and he was reading a novel by a Belfast writer, and he says, I don't like, I wouldn't be reading. He says, you're wrong, you're totally wrong, says Bob. Sometimes you get a better picture of things in a novel than you will others. Now, this is the question I have. First of all, did very few people read these things, these novels by Uí Fhlaithearta, few Irish people? And secondly, who is doing it today? Is anybody? Or who is criticising or analysing Irish society from a class point of view now? And last of all, was it all a waste of time writing these novels by Uí Fhlaithearta, when he could have been doing something like, I don't know.
One thing, as Eamon mentioned so kindly in the introduction, I've been involved in editing some working class writing, or writings by working class and working people. And by and large, the people who contributed to these anthologies, a lot of them said, number one, they started writing, or they are writing, because they couldn't find in the literature that is about people like them. They could only find middle class lives, which made them feel that there was something wrong with them. So that is the kind of the thinking behind these three anthologies. We wanted to publish that voice that was being completely sidelined by the establishment. So typically, and I will tell a particular story because I think it's very telling, but typically they might get back responses like, well, nobody's interested in this kind of story, you know, this is homelessness or whatever, you know, who wants to read about that? So they were being, the establishment doesn't want to hear those stories. But there's one particular story I want to tell. One of these writers, called Alan O'Brien, wrote some years ago a radio play called Snow Falls and So Do We, and it's based on the actual freezing to death of a young woman in Ballymun, in one of the flats in Ballymun. She froze to death. She died of hypothermia. And he won a prize for this radio play. I've forgotten the name of the prize.
P.G. O'Connor Award.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, on the strength of that, he submitted this to RTE for broadcast. And RTE said, no way are we going to broadcast this. This isn't what people want to hear. They changed the ending. She doesn't die in the play. Instead, she falls in love with the policeman and so on. And this the whole thing became not, it was rewritten. And he said, well, you're not, that's not my play. You can't, I'm not giving you permission to broadcast it. I think they did broadcast their own version, did they, Jim, or did they not?
I don't think it was broadcast at all.
Well, it mightn't have been broadcast enough. What do we see now coming into this winter? There will be more people dying of cold. This is actually true. And yet, the establishment would not allow working class tragedies. Don't exist. We don't want to hear about them. We don't want to publish them. We want nothing to do with them. And that is the experience. So when you're asking, do people write novels that reveal what's going on? Maybe they are. But how far do they get with this publication? So that would be my answer. This is an actual story.
The other questions?
Sorry?
Is that your answer to the other question?
That was to one question. I forgot what the other one was. But anyway,
Was it a waste of time? Was it a waste of time?
Well, is art a waste of life? A waste of time? That is what he did. I mean, his brother was more into the journalism. But what distinguishes us from animals in many other ways is that we produce art. Animals can't do that. It is something that makes us human. It has been there for as long as we have been human.
But that's okay. We
Is it?
the art and all that. But maybe Tom, what Tom was doing in journalism had a better chance of changing things than writing novels.
Well, I would say both of them ran into a wall in different ways. So that's very clear from his Irish language writings. He had to cut and censor himself in order to earn any money when he returned to Ireland. It's very, very clear. Look at the italics in his own published and unpublished writings.
Right,
what he had to put into italics was anything political or about the Free State and so on. He just had to cut that out completely. So Liam ran into a similar wall here.
Yes, completely, yes,
Yeah.
But so
But
you're back in the novel writing anyway.
Well, no, but leading on, Joseph, from what you said, who reads these novels? And I think that you are right, that the censorship of O'Flaherty has had an effect that lasts to this very day. Like, O'Flaherty is not really, I don't think anyway, correct me please if I'm wrong, but I don't think O'Flaherty is taught very much at the universities here. I think in the schools it's this one story, the sniper, which is better than nothing, but so censorship has a long-term effect.
So maybe what we're doing is important.
Yeah.
Trying to
Yeah.
bring them back. Maybe they're more relevant now than they were when they couldn't be read. Do you know what I mean?
Does anybody else want to say something? It doesn't have to be a question or anything. Well, Jim.
It seems that what Joseph said, he might be right. Liam's novels are looked at in the historical context of the times they were in it. They're good for reading from that point of view. Whereas Tom's writings aren't relevant even today if you read them. They're not even, they're non-fiction. They're have relevance today more than the novels looked at in a historical context. But the political writings are relevant even today. More hard-hitting.
I think, you know what really drew me to O'Flaherty in the first place? Was reading The House of Gold and thinking, nothing has changed. It's not as though this is over. And I think definitely it also, what happens in The House of Gold, the national bourgeoisie hogging the revolution is something that didn't just apply to Ireland, that happens frequently. Yeah.
You mentioned that the he mentioned the bourgeoisie that fought from 1918 to 1920. That's what Marx said. At the different stages, the feudalism replaced the aristocracy respect to the bourgeoisie, and then the proletariat takes over. There's a whole sequence there.
Yeah.
We wish.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate Jenny Farrell on a really comprehensive lecture, and as the chairman has pointed out, giving us many new insights into the writings of Liam Ó Fhlaithearta. I just love the work of Liam Ó Fhlaithearta, and I've been coming to Féile na Bhláthach for 8 years, and I hope the chairman will give me maybe 2 or 3 minutes to reflect on one or two things. As you pointed out, the society is now entering its 10th year, and I think it is very important that such a society exists to honour the amazing and stunning, very often stunning work of Liam Ó Fhlaithearta. In fact, Yeats himself said of the Black Soul that it embodies an energy that is genius, an energy that is genius. And when people read it, they'll appreciate that. I think it was either A.A. Kelly or Peter Costello who said that there are 3 great themes in the work, in the writings of Liam Ó Fhlaithearta. And these great themes are sex, politics, and nature and the sea. And I think all 3 themes are essential in an understanding of Ó Fhlaithearta. Duel, the volume of Irish short stories, was as recently as 2012 was translated into Spanish as deseo, the Spanish word for desire. And a Spanish reviewer wrote that the essence, the heart of everything that exists under the sun is trapped in Ó Fhlaithearta's stories. And an Indian researcher said that an objective study of nature in the short stories of Liam Ó Fhlaithearta, stories which are impassioned with tenderness and viciousness, that study yields a delicate study of erotica, a delicate study of erotica. Some creatures, he said, respond to a different divinity, and in these cases, the law of nature may permit more individuality than does, as the speaker pointed out, than does or social customs of the church. The Spanish reviewer that I mentioned, and you get this actually here on the island, you really appreciate this. The Spanish reviewer reviewing Duel of the Sale said that when we read Ó Fhlaithearta, we recognise ourselves in the hawk, in the cat, in the baby. We recognise ourselves in the old man, in the cow, and in the goose. And she said that his writings reveal the way in which actually man is nature. And Sean O'Riordan, the great Irish language poet from Cork, says, I've read some books of stories by Liam Ó Fhlaithearta and felt as if some living things had been caught between the pages. He said that if you hold a robin and feel him tremble in your hands, you will know what it felt like for me to read when I read Ó Fhlaithearta. And in an essay entitled Liam Ó Fhlaithearta, The Century of Cain, as in Cain and in Cain and Abel, the Mexican essayist and poet Jose Emilio Pacheco said that the ideas expressed by Ó Fhlaithearta, especially in his book 2 Years and in Train the Devil, also find expression in the works of Henry Miller and Louis Ferdinand Céline. And getting back to Almudena Sanchez, again talking about the stories of Fhlaithearta, said, we find a desire that beats, that does not allow sleep at night, more wild than civilized, of a purely irrational logic. And this is the wonderful line, a desire that floats in the air like a radioactive material about to explode. I think that's just a really powerful expression of what goes on in the short stories of Fhlaithearta. For sure, Liam Fhlaithearta's writings resonate with ideas to be found in Henry Miller and in Ernest Hemingway. In chapter 23 of 2 years of Fhlaithearta, and this could be taken out of any work of Henry Miller, of Fhlaithearta describes meeting a beautiful foreigner in a cafe in Greenwich Village in New York, a Russian woman, and then going with her to her rooms. For 10 days I went about as if in a dream, he said. So what I'm really getting at is what an absolutely wonderful writer Fhlaithearta is. And I just hope that the society, in the good work it's doing, the society will dwell some more in future on the events, on the kind of the life force and the power of nature and the sea to be found in his writings. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Pat.
And just following on what Shane said about is it all worthwhile and all that, I think we've done tremendous amount of work in them 10 years, and I think what we should do from here on out, because the committee is not getting any younger, is to try and resurrect the O'Flaherty House up in Cork and turn that into some sort of a place for artists to go. Artists that like O'Flaherty, that understand O'Flaherty, and can go there and can teach them.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that the powerful nature of O'Flaherty's writing, whether it's about nature, as Pat was saying, or the powerful depiction of people and the Free State and the system and the alienation and so on that Jenny so well described. I think that both, it just means that he's a really top quality writer. Hopefully, maybe it'd be a big job for the society as well to see if we could get O'Flaherty back onto the syllabus, because people are not getting. We got, in my generation, we were very lucky. We tasted the short stories in both languages, Irish and English. They're not. The young people are not getting that today, and I think it's something which should be put to rights as well. So we have plenty of work to do for the next 10 years.